Hello, my name is Andrew Keith, and today I'm going to be talking about American imperialism and how it pushed the United States into the position of being a global power. Now, while we know the United States' time of imperialism was in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there are a few key events that happened before this time that need to be addressed. The first of these is the Monroe Doctrine. President Monroe initially introduced the doctrine in 1823 as a warning to Europe. The fear was that Europe played too great of a role still in the Western Hemisphere. So Monroe decided to make a policy to protect the Western Hemisphere from foreign powers and to act as the police of the Western Hemisphere. However, given that the United States was a very young country at the time, European countries weren't exactly intimidated by the Monroe Doctrine. Now, manifest destiny was a term coined in 1845, and the meaning behind it is our God-given right, or that it was our right and obligation to expand across North America by any means. Since 1492, when Europe first came in contact with North America, the killing of Native Americans was a practice that was in place in order to expand by our God-given right. But in the 1800s is when the greater part of the genocide truly began. Expansions across the frontier sharply increased during this time as well. Now, something that everyone's heard of is social Darwinism, which was and still is a theory that basically says the strong live and the weak die. But most people know it as survival of the fittest. The belief was that the earth belongs to the strong and that the US saw themselves as being very strong, so they felt they were the strong and they must be the ones to survive. This was a very ethnocentric view at the time. Now, in 1890, the US reached a critical point in its development. We hit the end of the frontier. For almost 300 years of populating and spreading across North America, there was always more land to be discovered. Until now. Suddenly, the endless possibilities were not so endless. Americans began thinking about the fact that their land is limited as well as their resources. Of the resources we did have at the time, there was great excess that was going unused. The best option would be to trade more with foreign powers, not only to diminish our oversupply, but gain goods that were uncommon in the United States. Now, we discussed that when the Monroe Doctrine was first implemented, it wasn't really a threat to any of the European powers. Now, however, we start seeing examples of just how serious it was, which I'll show you in just a minute. But by actually enforcing the Monroe Doctrine, it really made it impossible to keep clinging to isolationism. So our first example or location is Venezuela. British Guiana and Venezuela had been in border disputes prior to the 1890s, but after the discovery of gold in Venezuela, the British decided it was time to end the dispute and begin the invasion of Venezuelan territory. President Cleveland, who was to enforce the Monroe Doctrine, reminded the British that the doctrine did influence Venezuela and advised them to pull out. The British ignored this warning, and so Cleveland felt the only reasonable response to this was to threaten war with Britain. Now, at this time, Britain's forces were spread thin by war and establishing African colonies, so they really weren't in a strong position to fight. So they pulled out of Venezuela. This act of abiding by the law of the Monroe Doctrine would end up leading to many other instances of this same tactic being used by the United States. The Spanish-American War was probably one of the more impressive acts of the United States made in the name of imperialism. Cuba had been trying to gain independence from Spain and form its own government, but Spain didn't want that. They fought the rebels in Cuba, and photographs of these gruesome incidents made their way to the United States, where they were published in newspapers all over the country. Americans rallied for Cuba's freedom after seeing the photographs, and so the United States demanded Spain leave Cuba and allow them to form an independent government. On April 24th, Spain declared war against the United States. The United States did the same to Spain on April 25th. The war only lasted 4 months, and the United States only suffered 1 casualty and 7 wounded soldiers, while Spain saw over 400 deaths. The Spanish-American War came to an end when the Treaty of Paris was signed. Spain agreed to give Cuba freedom and release all claims to the Philippines to the United States for $20 million. The United States took the Philippines to protect them from anarchy and the potential for European powers to come in and influence them negatively. The open door policy was created because the United States wanted more trade partners, as we discussed in the End of the Frontier. There was a lot of supply goods that needed to be removed from the United States since no one needed them. They were in surplus. But overseas, they could be sold. The place that the United States looked to was the same place that all of Europe looked to, as well as Japan at the time: China. China was quickly developing and had the potential to make America wealthy. Japan, the United States, and the European powers divided China into different sections for each country to trade with, known as the spheres of influence. These countries not only brought trade to China, but also missionaries to spread religion. The Boxer Rebellion was China's reaction to the open door policy, since not all Chinese people approved of it. The extremists who were opposed to the open door policy were known as Boxers, and they would kill missionaries as a way to demonstrate their opposition. The world did not react well to the Boxers, and so Japan, the United States, and the European powers sent in troops from each country to stop the rebellions. To repent for the killing of missionaries, China was fined separate amounts by each country, which totaled in the hundreds of millions paid out. Arguably, one of the best presidents the United States had was Theodore Roosevelt. What he did for imperialism was to shoulder the burden of the Western Hemisphere's debt to Europe. Countries that owed European power and money were relieved of the debt, and the United States would instead owe the European powers themselves. This was known as the Roosevelt Corollary. This worked because after the Spanish-American War, the United States was seen as a world power, and had demonstrated its power against Spain and Britain already, as well as in separate incidents against Germany. It also made it so there was no European influence over the Western Hemisphere that the United States did not control. And here is a lovely picture of Theodore Roosevelt, arguably one of the greatest presidents of all time. It's just a nice photo, that's all. So, what did we learn? Well, first off, we know that the United States took on the role of policing the Western Hemisphere by the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary. We also know that social trends such as Darwinism helped cause imperialism, which pushed the United States onto the world stage as a real power. Other causes of imperialism include the end of the frontier and the need to trade surplus goods. Now the question is, what did we gain from all this? We expanded the United States' influence and borders overseas for starters. There's also increased trade and Christianity. The United States did end up becoming a world power. But what else came from all of this? The answer is a heavy burden. Now, what I mean by this is that the United States didn't necessarily need to become the police of the Western Hemisphere. It was because they were afraid of Europe's influence, but in reality, Europe wasn't really concerned with the United States. What did come of our policing half the world was a lot of aggression and lack of proper diplomacy. We now see further instances of the United States policing, but it spread to the entire world. Who knows when the United States will feel safe? It may only be when the entire world is under our influence. I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to this, and I hope you've enjoyed it, learned something from it, and thank you again.